Sustainable You is a casual, interactive, yet informative series detailing and cataloging the sustainability experience. Moreover, this is a short podcast docuseries detailing the thoughts and experiences of passionate advocates towards all things eco-friendly. Our journey is to know how and why understanding sustainable development towards the triple bottom line of people, profit, and planet can contribute to a more mindful, holistic, and inclusive world. Specifically, this podcast showcases what makes you a changemaker, innovator, and transformer as you tackle sustainability challenges for current and future generations to resolve the so-called wicked problems. Green Calgary is a leading urban environmental charity supporting Calgarians to become more sustainable in working, learning, living, and playing. Originally begun as an initiative in the late 1970s, Green Calgary has been advocating and encouraging others to adopt a more eco-friendly and greener lifestyle, thereby allowing for a healthier local community for our city and beyond. Green Calgary showcases a diverse palette of public educational programming from the get-go of providing experiential learning from grade school children to transitioning blue and white-collar professionals. For today's episode, I sat down with the Executive Director, Lex Van Raadt, to learn how this inclusive hub is a local lyceum as a valuable educational services provider of environmentalism and sustainable development to create healthy homes, workplaces, and communities.
Okay, would you be able to introduce yourself? So just give a brief intro, who you are, and you can give us a little bit of a background about your organization. That would be great.
Yeah, so my name is Lex Van Raadt. I'm the Executive Director of Green Calgary. And Green Calgary is a leading urban environmental charity based in Calgary, Alberta. We've been in operation for just over 45 years. And really, we do mostly environmental education with a few different sort of projects here and there, a couple fundraising projects, things like that. We're probably best known for our rainwater capture program. So we sell rain barrels. We've been working with the city of Calgary on that program for about 35 years. And we are also really well known in the school system because we do a lot of programming for primary students. So I guess that's Green Calgary.
Okay, great. And actually, before we jump more, again, to the formal questions, we're going to just play a quick icebreaker, if that's cool with you. And then basically what you have to do is just choose one adjective from the list that best describes your personal nature. And then you're going to just explain why you chose that word. So I'm just going to send that to you now. And again, we don't mean to typecast your personality as being type A or B or anything like that. But basically, we want you to do this because we want to know like what best depicts your persona in regards to your current vocation, your career, your calling, or you want to call it.
I think that one's good. The first one that jumped out to me is relaxed. So we'll go with relaxed.
Okay, and why did you choose that word?
One of the things I really try to do a lot is just sort of emphasize to people that, working in the environmental sector, combating climate change, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. It's a lot of work. A lot of people are working on it. And, you have to make sure that you take breaks, that you practice some self-care, just so that people don't burn out, because it's kind of one of the biggest hurdles of at least this century, if not the previous one as well. And it's not going to go away in a day. And, if you burn yourself out on it, pushing yourself every single day, that's not going to help anyone, least of all you. So I try to take a very sort of like calm approach and emphasize that this is really important work to be doing. And, we do need to move quickly on it, but people also need to take care of themselves as people.
Okay. No, that's a valid response. I like how you didn't choose bold or anything because everyone's been choosing that lately. But okay, no, that's fair enough. That's the first time I've gotten that response, so that's good. Okay, so just to get to know you a little bit better. So this question asks, what makes you uncertain and what makes you curious?
I mean, it's uncertainties, like everything in the future is uncertain. And I always struggle to try to articulate what, I'll have a hunch or I'll have a theory of what's going to change within the next 6 months, year, couple years, and so I'm doing forecasting and stuff like that for my role. And I find that very challenging to try to say, like, okay, well, why do I think this? Like, what informs this hunch? So definitely, like, future, very uncertain, just sort of, yeah, in general. And then what was the second one? Uncertain and
Curious. What makes you curious?
Curious. Always, I'm always very curious about people. One of the things that I found that I didn't really expect when I went into this field is that we end up working with a lot of people, especially lots of volunteers, lots of people in other organizations. And I'm always just interested to hear their stories, learn more about, how they came to where they are, why they do what they do. And so that's been a really rewarding part of being this role as well, because it just shows that, there's lots of diversity in voices that are out there. And I'm just really interested to learn more about them.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that. And so for this next question, I just want to, again, get to know you a little bit better. So tell me about yourself, your struggles, your aspirations, and your contributions that led to you getting involved in climate change action.
Yeah, so I would say, I kind of came to climate change action sort of sideways. I knew for a long time that I really wanted to work in some sort of nonprofit space. And I've worked in a couple different kinds of nonprofits before. Most notably in the arts. I did quite a few years working for arts organizations, and I was really just looking for a place where I could, work with people that I respected and found interesting and stuff like that. And then when I ended up at Green Calgary, I found a lot of people that I really respected and found really interesting. And so I kind of continued there, and really a lot of my motivation comes from, trying to make the contributions of others better, right? Trying to support other people's voices. Because I think that's the kind of leadership that I try to bring to the organization, is sort of a supportive leadership, right? Kind of be behind people and just say, like, oh yeah, you have a great idea. Well, let's do whatever we can to make your great idea happen. So that's really where I come from to get into this field. And, don't get me wrong, I was always interested in environment. It just was sort of one of many interests. And, I like to mention this story that I before I started working at Green Calgary, I was like, oh yeah, I'm such an environmentalist. I understand this topic super, super well. And then I did my interview and I'm like, maybe I don't understand it quite as well as I thought. And then I started working at Green Calgary and I went, oh my, I have so much to learn. And so it's just been a constant journey of learning, but also being able to support people. And I find that really rewarding.
Okay, interesting. So for you, environmentalism wasn't something that necessarily stemmed from your childhood growing up. You kind of got into it later on, into like climate change advocacy sort of thing. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, I was interested when I was young in environment in terms of, like, I was a really avid camper. I guess I still am an avid camper, but I didn't really connect the two. I was like, oh yeah, I like being outdoors. I like camping. I like nature, and it didn't really click for me until I was at Green Calgary how connected these things were.
Okay, interesting. No, it's interesting how it helped you foster a more holistic point of view on everything. And just on that point, what would you say are the most important personal satisfactions and dissatisfactions connected with the sustainability sector, especially towards some things like climate action? What do you personally find, I guess, the most satisfying and the most challenging about running an environmental nonprofit?
It's funny because it's kind of the same thing. So the thing that's most satisfying is working with other people, right? Bringing in a whole bunch of different voices, bringing in a whole bunch of different ideas, and kind of uniting whenever we get a chance to partner with other organizations, see what other organizations are working on. That's always an extremely exciting thing to do. And it kind of like, it leaves you with this great feeling afterwards, right? Like, coming together, we can really do big changes. But then the frustrating thing is it's really hard to get people together. And I find that, climate advocacy and climate action groups and environmental groups of all sorts, there's a lot of them out there. There's a lot of them in Calgary. And we try to organize as much as possible, but, there's still a lot of people doing their own thing, not necessarily doing the best job of sharing those things with other organizations, not always doing the best job partnering. So that's kind of where I always say my dissatisfaction comes from. I wish we could do more together, but there's a lot of things that make that difficult. Some of them systemic, some of them capacity, and we just got to keep trying. But yeah, that's how those things kind of balance out.
Okay, interesting. And is there anything in particular that motivates you to keep going in this field? Like you had mentioned earlier, burnout. What makes you want to keep pursuing what you do?
Again, it's kind of supporting people, right? So what really drives me, especially on the day-to-day, is like looking at people on my team or people that we partner with and saying, wow, like you're super smart, or you have a really cool idea, or, we really haven't heard a voice like yours in a while. Let's support that and let's protect that and make sure that, you can do that work without fear, right? Fear of burnout or fear of reprisal or all sorts of things, right? So for me, the thing that really motivates me all the time is just looking at these amazing people that I'm working with all the time and saying, okay, well, I'm in a good position that I can support those people, and how can I do that?
Okay, interesting. Okay, great. Thanks for sharing more about your background. It's really nice to get to know how you came into this field. And now just to get to know a bit more about Green Calgary and the organization itself. So do you want to talk more about its origins, how it began? Because I was reading up how it started in the 1970s. It's kind of like the perfect and opportune moment because that's when all the global environmentalism movements were kind of emerging. So yeah, do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look back to the late 70s, you won't hear mention of Green Calgary because it started as an organization called Clean Calgary, and it actually started as the Clean Calgary Committee, which was a committee formed at the city to clean up the Bow River. There was just increases in pollution in the 70s. A lot of the infrastructure around, landfill and stuff like that was still being developed, and this committee got together to do the Bow River cleanup. And after that was done, it was like, well, what else can we do? What else can we clean up? And then that just kept on piling up to more and more programming. And pretty quickly we ended up working with developing more recycling programming. For many years, we ran a shop, called it the Waste It Not shop, which was a place where construction companies and stuff like that could come and drop off like old materials, and then other people could come and purchase them. So construction supply, often you have like weird leftovers that it's like, well, this isn't really like, you can't return it because it's like half of a board or whatever, half of a paint can, sort of weird things like that. And so we had made a store for that. That eventually evolved into our eco store, which was one of the very early sort of environmental sustainable supply stores in Calgary. So, bringing in things like composters. That's where our rain barrel program started, was with the store. And we just kind of kept on picking up whatever we were seeing as like a need. So as we find out about emerging needs, we would see a way that we could help. We often work pretty closely with the city of Calgary. I mean, we were originally an offshoot of them 45 years ago, so kind of makes sense. But yeah, we frequently work with their education teams and their climate and environment team now. And so we can sort of hear through their channels like, hey, these are things where we're seeing increasing need. These are things where we're looking at doing some work, and we can find places where we as a charity can step in and help out.
Okay, great. And how would Green Calgary, I guess, advocate for climate change action and leadership through community engagement? I know, yeah, you have a diverse range of public education programs on environmentalism. So I'm curious as, I guess, how you became that leading environmental nonprofit here in Calgary. I guess you can talk more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a lot of different ways that you can approach climate advocacy, and we come at it from an education approach. And that is absolutely not the only approach, and it is absolutely not the only approach we need. We need a lot of different approaches, but we sort of started in the education space, and so that's kind of where we found our niche, where we stay. And then when people come and work with us, a lot of volunteers will say, "Oh yeah, I want to volunteer and help you out with your education programs." And then they'll say, well, I also want to do some lobbying, or I want to do some activism, or I want to find a place where I can do some research. And then we know other organizations, and we can say, oh, have you talked to these folks? Have you talked to these folks? They're looking for help. So we can kind of connect people. Our particular area is in the education piece, and we sort of focus that on 3 different areas. So we have a sort of public education area that we usually call it our community programs, but we also have youth education. And so we have a bunch of programs, particularly for primary school, but we have some for other levels as well. And then we have some for workplaces too. So we have both products, services, and education for workplaces too, so that, we can kind of find people wherever they're at in their current sort of sustainability journey, and then help them get to where they're looking to go. And then, if we're not the people to work with them the entire length of that journey, which we typically are not, we have the sort of resources to connect them with, whoever's the person in the next step of that journey.
Okay, no, it's definitely interesting. You can almost ignite the spark, I guess, and then I guess people can follow through and follow up. Okay, it's interesting. Yeah. And what would you say are Green Calgary's core values and intent? Is there almost like a basic philosophy of your nonprofit that you would say?
Yeah, so we really believe, we've had this very similar mission statement for a really long time, but we really believe that Calgary could be like a world leader in sustainability. We have all of the things here that we need to do that. And so we're always sort of basing everything we do on the idea, like, if we get people with enough education in this topic, if we get people interested enough, if there's enough momentum, Calgary could really be a city that other places look to and say, how can we emulate what Calgary's doing? Like, look at all of their great programs. So that's kind of a lot of our driving force, is this idea that, Calgary is in this like perfect place where we have everything we need to be a world leader in sustainability, and just, trying to get us there. What that looks like in practice is usually, educating, providing environmental products, environmental services, and also connecting. We try to maintain a lot of connections with other environmental nonprofits, but also with government, and with a lot of like community groups and stuff like that, so that, we can help connect people together to try to grow this community.
Okay, no, it's interesting, and I think I like your perspective that has a very positive spin on it, because I think Calgary and Alberta in general, we get typecasted as typical oil and gas industry, and we're not really seen as, like, whenever I would tell people at Canada, they always associate Vancouver as a green oasis, but I think there's so much potential for Calgary to grow, like you said. Yeah. Okay, great. And just on this, so you kind of did share about your programming, but do you want to share a bit more about the diverse palette of public education programs you offer? Because I noticed you offer everything ranging from educating more younger children, so grade school children, on sustainable development, to more blue and white collar working professionals. You don't have to go into all of it, but you can like briefly talk about that.
Yeah, so sort of we try to see how many of the big kind of environmental topics we can tackle at once. So a lot of our school programs currently, we're really focused on circular economy programs. So a lot of things about, for primary students, how landfills work, and that's a program that we've been doing in some form or another with the city of Calgary for a very long time, and it's a really fruitful one, because understanding how the landfill works and why we do things a certain way and how we might be able to change that, it really gives that core understanding to sort of get a lot of students to say, oh, well, now I know why we recycle, or, I need to pay more attention to compost and things like that. So really giving that sort of perspective. And then our main programs that we're doing right now for communities really focus on, one is for reducing food waste. And that one also looks at everything from proper food storage to where you can get produce at a decent cost, which is an increasing problem in everywhere really, but here obviously. And that one really ties into food security, and we really try to go out and talk to many sort of newcomer groups and work with immigrant serving agencies to really get that information out to people, especially people who are new to Calgary. We also have a public program that we work on that is about energy efficiency, and that one really tries to get people to understand, what are these numbers on your energy bill, because they are very confusing. I've sat through the program multiple times, and still sometimes I have to ask questions of, wait, which one was that? And, that's something that we've all been working on for a while. But then it also goes into, well, here are some ways that you can sort of limit your energy consumption by, energy efficient means. Some of those are very simple. Some of them are more complicated. That one has sort of like a follow-up program too that really goes into depth about okay, so you're thinking about getting solar panels, or you're thinking about getting a heat pump. Let's talk about those specific items as well. And then for our workplace programs, probably the one that's the most well-known, I guess there's maybe two. So we do waste audits. Those are for building certifications. So there's a whole bunch of different kinds of building certifications. Probably the most common ones we hear about are LEED certification and BOMA BEST certification. And those are both environmental certifications for buildings. And so property managers will reach out to us and get us to come in and do those reports for them. And then we also do event greening. So we'll go out to events and we'll bring out teams of staff and volunteers to help make sure that they divert as much waste as possible away from the landfill and into recycling programs or composting programs. And we're really busy with that one in the summer when there's lots of events.
Oh, wow. You're doing a whole lot of stuff. Yeah, no, it's great. And okay, so now thanks again for sharing more about your organization. So now we're just going to move on to this next question. So I actually want to know your personal definition of sustainable development and sustainability. And so how do you personally view it, especially within the framework of climate change advocacy? And is your viewpoint similar to your nonprofit's perspective on that?
I would say so, because I think a lot of my viewpoint has come from directly out of my work. So, I wasn't trained in any sort of climate science myself. I hire people who do. And that's, I try to hire the experts. But really my background came from more social science side of things. And I think, it's this big balancing act of what will make us sustainable. But I think the big part there is doing things that are more harmonious, taking a more holistic approach, taking a long-term view, because a lot of the systems that are in place, we put in these systems and models of thinking that are, either very short-term or they are very much a model. They're not taking into account the diversity of what things can happen. We just sort of say okay, well, here's a model for what, the economy will look like in the next 5 years. And we're just going to take that model as if it's truth. And it's well, the world's way more complicated than any model you can make. Although that might be starting to change more and more the more sophisticated models get. But it's trying to look at those things and say, okay, well, how can we take a long-term view, a holistic view that brings in as many different sort of viewpoints as possible, and sort of look at the intersectionality between sustainability in terms of environment, in terms of human health, in terms of identities, in terms of systems of justice and systems of oppression, and really try to look at all of these things together and make something that's going to serve the greater good over the long term. So that's kind of where I come from it. But a lot of that is really born out of listening to folks on the ground when we're out there doing programs. Is not really, I'm not coming at it from a sort of climate science background.
Okay, interesting. And I'm sure you heard about the Sustainable Development Goals. So is there any particular SDG that you best advocate for? And do you still think metrics like these, do they still hold merit?
Yeah, so it depends on programs. So we'll often link different programs that we're doing with different goals. Obviously, we're very frequently working with goals around water because of our rainwater capture program and because of all the programs we do with the watersheds here in Calgary. And other goals, especially around waste, are very common ones for us to work with as well, because we have a lot of programs that are tied into the waste programs. So those are definitely sort of the main ones. But we've had a big graphic before that shows all the different ones we work in, and it's tons, right? Like there's a lot of
Yeah.
those that intersect with different programs. And I do think that they are a pretty good encapsulation. Like I like especially the SDGs because there's a lot of them and they cover a lot of ground. I mean, are they perfect? No. There's probably some things missing. There's probably sometimes I look at one and I'm like, it's kind of like, what we're doing is half in this goal and third in this goal. And, but they're there as a simplification, right? And if we use them as such, then I think they are a helpful thing to follow. And they can give you useful metrics to measure against, especially year over year. And, we kind of need some sort of goalposts because, the kind of goalposts you hear about in the media are too big to work towards at any sort of municipal level, at least, if not, like an individual level. So, how does an individual limit, world warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? That's like, it's like asking for, how do you fit into this, like your 1/10 billionth of a puzzle? How do you fit in?
Yeah.
That's really, really hard to imagine. So SDGs help break that down, and then frequently we're breaking that down further, and they're useful metrics to have so that you have something that you can follow. But yeah, they are just going to be a sort of a model of one way of looking at things.
Okay, yeah, no, it's interesting to hear your perspective, and I agree how you mentioned to use them as goalposts because they are very much overarching and generic. But it's interesting because when I was in grad school, there's this whole thing of how the SDGs are very much flawed, and I don't know if it's more of a Swedish concept. But they had mentioned during these discussions that the SDGs, they really buy into the Anthropocene. So it's a very human-centric, self-centered thinking. We're not really taking that ecocentric perspective. We're not, or biocentrism, as you want to call it, and we're not being inclusive of all the flora and fauna. So I didn't get and you just assume this is how the way you do things. So yeah, I like how you mentioned it. It's not, perfect, but it's something to work with. So it's definitely interesting to hear your take on that.
Yeah, and especially when you think of things as models, right? Like it's a model. Even climate change is a climate change model that we work things on. And the real world is just way more complicated than any model. So we need something to work with because like if you say, okay, well we're not going to use any sort of model, you just don't know how to say whether you did anything or not, right? It's impossible. So, we need something, but yeah, there's different models out there. And maybe somebody could come up with a more of an ecocentric model. That would be an interesting thing to see. But I think SDGs are fairly well known. And so that helps to just sort of say, like, here are some goalposts that we know about and that we can measure and that we have been measuring. Because the other thing about coming up with a better model is that then we're measuring anew. And then it's hard to measure against anything, right? And people will say, well, how do we do in like 2025 versus 2019? It's like, well, we don't know because the model doesn't work for 2019. It works for 2025. So, we kind of have to work with what we got, but definitely having some other ways of approaching the data is really helpful too.
Okay, interesting. And just on that point, so I wanted to talk more about degrowth. As you know, the SDGs wouldn't really be promoting something like that. And I'm sure you've heard about the degrowth movement. So I know you work with a lot of local businesses. So how do you find that businesses here in Calgary can balance things like sustainability goals that they've set while also striving towards economic growth? So even, the concept of sustainable development itself seems like a paradox when you read it out. So I guess what are your thoughts on the whole idea of the degrowth movement and decommodification, especially towards living more mindfully and in a more minimalist way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to one of the things that I remember from when I first started in this field about 8 years ago now. One of the first things I heard, I was listening to I was trying to get more familiar with concepts around climate change, and I was listening to a bunch of podcasts, and I listened to a podcast, which I'd love to shout out which one it was, but I don't remember. And in it, they were taking in calls from people, calling to ask questions. And this person called in and said, oh, I've done all of these things to make my life more sustainable. And they were listing things like getting solar panels, switching to all of their vehicles are EVs, and things like this. And they said, what else can I do? And the podcast was sort of like, well, okay, I guess the most important thing you can do is go out and vote for people who are, supporting climate change policies and stuff like that, which was a good answer. But the thing I thought about it after listening to this is I'm like, so you didn't change anything other than like you swapped one product for another product, right? Because they're saying, well, I changed all of my cars for EVs. Well, you didn't reduce how much you're driving. You didn't change anything about you. You just changed what you paid for. And that doesn't mean that that's a bad thing to do. I think that was probably, this person was obviously very acting in earnest, but really, that's just that doesn't necessarily lead to the same kind of long-term change because you haven't changed your behaviors and you haven't changed your way of thinking. You've really only changed your purchasing. And so whenever I always think of that example when I think of, something like deep growth, just because really it comes back to, and what we're trying to do all the time is show people that they can just form new habits that are more, to use a word that you did, harmonious, right? Like you can really, behavior change is the best thing we can do for the environment. Just change how we approach things. It's also one of the hardest things to do. We have all of these statistics for how much time it takes to form a habit, but none of those statistics ever say, well, how much effort does it take to keep a habit? And, you can form a habit in a relatively small amount of time, but keeping it can be extremely difficult, especially if for some reason you have to stop, right? So we're constantly talking to people about ways that they can change their behavior. And the fact of the matter is that behavior change is one of the greatest things that you can do. It's also one of the slowest, right? And it takes a lot of effort on a lot of person power to sort of teach somebody what they can do differently, and that person to spend a lot of their energy to change what they're doing or how they're thinking. So, I think of these things together, like when you're talking about like decommodification, those sorts of things are kind of what we want to aim for, but those are the long-term goals. And those are things that are very difficult to do. And so we need to be doing them. We need to be pushing for that sort of stuff. But we also have to recognize that, we'll lose tons of people along the way if we don't give people some easier goalposts, if we want to go back to that idea, right? So, when we look at it, we say, yes, it would help if we could, switch people's cars over to EVs. That reduces emissions. It causes all these other issues too, but, we have to deal with what is directly in front of us while we continue to work towards those bigger, longer term goals, and especially ones around changing the way that we interact with the world around us.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, it's good. And is there, because again, going back to local businesses, is there anything that they can do to be more consistent in achieving these, I guess, overarching goals? Is there any non-negotiable sustainable principles they should uphold, I guess, regardless of the economic opportunities available, just so they can move towards that idea of, like you mentioned, slow consumption?
Yeah, so I think usually when we talk to companies, we just try to show them that there is value, because they're often looking at like, hey, where's the value in this? And it can be easy for the value to be kind of hidden. So we're often taking the perspective of like, okay, well, here's where the value is. And you have to think of value to people. That includes employees and customers and even, vendors and stuff like that. So what is the value to those around you? What is the value to, you as a company, as a brand? What is the value to, your expenses day to day, right? The fact of the matter is a lot of things that are really good for the environment are actually really good for business too. You just there's a sort of startup cost that people have to understand and be willing to take. And sometimes it takes education. Sometimes it takes somebody who knows what they're doing beforehand. It's one of the reasons that, we've liked to see sort of how many businesses now have those ESGs, environmental, social, and governance goals, because often they're tying those goals to one another. And that's kind of, in our opinion, sort of the right thing to do is realize that these things are linked. And so usually when we're working with businesses, we try to define that value for them. And then we try to say like, okay, well, look at the things that you're doing. And then, where do you see the most value and what you can change? And then usually trying to show them where there's lots of stuff that you can change that you don't think of. I find that a lot of the groups that we're working with, they're thinking externally. They're thinking of like operations at the big scale. And we're like, okay, but your cafeteria doesn't have a compost bin, right? And they don't really think of that necessarily because that's not part of the public persona. That's not part of, the big picture. But it takes sort of big picture and little picture thinking to try to, drive some of that change. And, if you're doing one thing externally, but you're not doing it internally, then you're not really going to live up to that change, right? And it's the same thing when, there's lots of companies that put out ESGs, and one of their environmental goals, they have like really big environmental goals for their operations, but they're big goals that kind of miss the point of changing how they're like what the values of the organization are. And so like helping them realize that the connections between their values and their goals is really important.
Interesting. No, it's definitely insightful. And from your perspective, just working with these different businesses, what are the problems you see working in this field? And are there any particular social problems that stick out to you that you've identified? And how does Green Calgary respond to that?
Yeah, so one of the things that we found the most that's very sad is that a lot of businesses are just sort of afraid of celebrating the things that they do well. Right. There's been, they've seen so many instances in the media where a company will try to basically greenwash what they're doing and then getting slammed for it, rightfully, that even when they do something good, they're worried to share it. And that's unfortunate because, it means that the incentives are being cut away, right? That we're moving from the carrot to the stick, right? People are changing, but they're not necessarily changing for the right reasons, or they're just keeping those reasons hidden, or their changes hidden, right? And so the example I always think of is we once went and we were doing a consulting job for a brewery, and they had amazing environmental programs. And we're like, how have we never heard about these environmental programs before? This is awesome stuff that you're doing here. And they said, well, but we use a lot of water. And so anytime we say, hey, look at this great environmental program we're doing over here, people say, yeah, but you use a lot of water. And they just wanted to avoid the publicity. And that was kind of heartbreaking, right? Because it's like, well, how are they ever going to get to, where they can cut their water and figure out cool programs like that if they can never talk about the stuff that they're already doing? So we're often trying to encourage businesses to celebrate their wins and not downplay their failures. It's people don't want to appear like they're doing something bad, kind of universal, but it's okay to say like, hey, we're not here on our goals to do this yet, but look at how good we're doing over here. Like, look at this great thing. Let's celebrate that and keep working towards the other one. So we're often trying to help with that aspect of their culture. Like, don't hide the things that you still have to work on, but celebrate the things that you are working on, and then set goals to expand them. Because the other side of that is that people will say, well, yeah, we have a recycling program, we're done. And it's like, well, there's a lot more that you can do. That should be like, maybe your goal was to get a recycling program, but then after you have it, find the next goal, right? So trying to keep it as a journey, because it is, like I said earlier, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. So finding all of those goalposts and continuing to work towards being more sustainable all the time.
Yeah, no, I agree. Celebrating those small wins is definitely crucial. And do you find that there are certain skills that are the most important for being a change maker or leader when it comes to climate action?
There's a whole bunch of different skills that can be helpful, and I've seen it in a whole bunch of different people in different ways. But a lot of people who have vision, who will look at something and say like, "Hey, how can we do this better?" Those people are really important. You need leaders who are going to say like, "Yeah, let's actually have like I can see a potential direction, and let's actually have a plan to get there." Because with no plan, it's just not going to happen. So that one's really important, but it's also important to have people who are, you need both like the strategic thinkers and the sort of tactical thinkers. You need the people who sort of have the long view and shorter view. And you need people who kind of are looking outward, but also looking inward. I find that a lot of places they'll say, "Hey, environmental, that's an outward thing." And so they'll sort of concentrate there. And it's like, well, no, being good to the environment is also about being, good to your employees and having a safe and healthy work environment for them. That includes, environmental programs and includes enriching programs, because that's going to make them better and it's going to make the environmental programs you do more effective. So just try to have leaders that kind of both have that sort of vision, but also have that sort of more holistic view.
Okay, interesting. And just on that, because I was reading up on some of your programming, so what advice can you give to those that are interested in citizen science for climate change action? Do you believe that there's some sort of pattern or formula to becoming a successful citizen scientist? Because I notice, especially towards the youth, you're kind of gearing that programming. Do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, it's interesting kinds of programming to just get people out there and start providing scientific data to scientists. There's tons of platforms that will do this for you. You really just have to find what drives your passion, because again, it's, making sure you have motivation. So you could find a citizen science type platform that doesn't really like suit your interests, and you're just never going to really engage with it. If you really like, taking like walking and looking at birds or taking pictures of like urban wildlife, there's apps that you can use where you can take pictures and say like, "Hey, I saw a skunk this place this time," right? And that information all goes to conservation scientists, and then they can use that data to make their models better, to make their data better in general. And that's information that's going to go to your municipality, it's going to go to the province, it's going to get spread around to other universities so that they can do more research. Like there's lots of really, really good benefits to that. And you get to participate in sort of the larger sort of community practice, right? So I would say definitely, if you're interested in something like citizen science, just look at the stuff that you're already interested in and see if there's a way that you can contribute. Because there's ones for like everything.
Okay, great.
They're not all called citizen science anymore. They've actually moved away from that term somewhat. I can't remember what the new one is, though.
Okay. Well, if you find it, you can send it to me, because I'm curious about that and getting to more about that. And I just guess just more on that. So what's your perspective on environmental activism, and maybe even citizen science, if it plays into it, on concepts like just sustainability and environmental justice? So as you know, here in Calgary locally, we have things like Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future, and I'm an ex-reporter, so I remember covering some of those protests, especially pre-COVID and going into COVID. I guess I can read out the definition of just sustainability for you, so just read it out here and then you can respond to it. So sustainability cannot simply be a green or environmental concern, important though environmental aspects of sustainability are. A truly sustainable society is one where wider questions of social needs and welfare and economic opportunity are integrally related to environmental limits imposed by supporting ecosystems. So that's by the founding father of just sustainability. So do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of going back to earlier when we were talking about, I don't remember. Here, let me say, it goes back to intersectionality, right? So like it was when we were talking about sustainability. What does sustainability mean? And, there's tons of different parts of our system that make the world sustainable. And, environment is just part of that. There's a lot of things in there too around, like justice, social justice, lots of things around, reducing inequalities of all sorts that are really important to climate change activism as well, right? So, we tend to, like Green Calgary really tends to encourage people to get involved in whatever it is that they're passionate about, because we need passionate people putting in, the time and the effort. But that also means, not everybody can put in the time and the effort. And that comes back to making sure that people kind of have the environment and the opportunities and the supports so that they can actually do this important work. Because, we need to tackle climate change together. It's not going to be something that we can tackle by having a small percentage of people working on it. And how people get together is by finding ways that their messages and their passions interact, right? So we're always happy to hear when different organizations get together on different issues. It's one of the reasons why we started to do programming that, our food waste program in particular and our energy efficiency program, they're also looking at how do we reduce costs? How do we, make things more equitable for newcomers and for immigrants? And that all ties together, right? Like it's really all of these different movements of social justice and environmental justice, and they all interact, and you can look at them in a silo, and that works for a very, very short amount of time, but to really make meaningful change, we need to work together.
Interesting. No, I like how you explain it from that perspective, intersectionality and having to adopt systems thinking and that viewpoint. And just on that, so how does Green Calgary actually measure their social impact in a local community? And, when it comes to things like both social and environmental impact. So basically, how do you help those who may be overlooked, underrepresented, marginalized in Calgary? Because I talked to one organization earlier, I think it was Climate Hub, and they have this really cool project that they do. And I never picked up on this, but they had said, and later on, of course, growing up, but they do this like greening project where they like plant trees in like underrepresented neighborhoods, and they really advocate for things like community gardening. And I grew up in Calgary, like I was born and raised here, and I grew up in the Northeast, but I never really noticed it until later on that we don't have enough tree chops here and stuff like that. So is that another direction you want to go into? Like I know you do have those public education programs for grade schoolers, but do you have anything to support those who are vulnerable, but they want to get more involved in climate action, but they maybe lack a sense of agency?
Yeah, absolutely. And so like some of those public programs that we're doing are kind of tackling that in part. And then we also look at, other people who are doing those programs, and we try to partner with them or at least support them. So yeah, like we've been out to the Climate Hub's tiny forests as well. They're awesome. And so when we hear about programs like that, we try to make sure that we're helping any way we can, whether that's promoting through our networks, whether that's, if we happen to be working with a community association and we hear somebody say something about wanting to plant more trees, we go, aha, we know somebody you should talk to. So there's a lot of that. We don't want to double up and have too many programs that are just, like competing when we can instead work together. So we're always looking for those opportunities. And then we try to measure what we're doing based on, we kind of do our own sort of needs assessment. So we'll say like, okay, let's look at what kind of programming is out there. Where do we see what's missing, right? And we just try to meet a lot of people, talk to a lot of people. We have a really awesome volunteer pool. So those volunteers will come in and they'll often say like, hey, this is what I'm interested in, or I came from this country and I'm getting settled here. And then through that, we can learn just tons of stuff about what people are interested in, where people are seeing gaps. And then that gives us the opportunity to try to help fill some of those. And sometimes that's not us doing any sort of programming. Sometimes that's just us connecting people. It kind of depends on what it is and what our capacities are. I mean, we are still a charity, so we do have some limited funding and limited capacities, unless we find, a bunch of people that we can partner with. So we're always keeping an eye open on that. And then we're just trying to, what programming we do have, we try to make good on those and grow them as much as possible and make them as well supported as possible, while keeping our eyes open for other things that we could be helping with or supporting.
Okay, great. And just on that, so I guess I want to talk a bit more about youth and young persons, because that's a lot of where your programming is based around. So how can they, I guess, be taught to become leaders in the emerging sustainability sector in Alberta? So as you can see, because I used to work in corporate news and I would post some stories on this, but Alberta, as you know, is currently facing a brain drain due to the lack of opportunity. And I find many younger people, they're graduating and they're relocating elsewhere to find meaningful and purposeful work, just because they don't want to work in things like the oil and gas industry. So how does, I guess, your organization, how does Green Calgary mobilize youth, again, to gain that agencies so they can pursue those careers in climate action and they can become leaders earlier on in their community, for example, by becoming maybe entrepreneurs or learning how to run their own business sort of thing? Like, do you do that sort of thing? Or, yeah, you can talk more about that.
Yeah, we mostly, part of this is through education. So through our programming, we try to instill information so that people can sort of know what options are available to them and have a better understanding and grow a passion, right? We're really trying to inspire people and say like, hey, this is something that you could help with. This is a challenge you could help tackle, and give people hope. I think one of the things that's missing for a lot of youth is just any sort of hope that stuff can change. And, I think part of that hope comes from community saying, hey, there's a lot of us working in this. It can seem very isolating, especially when you're not really getting involved with groups and communities that are out there doing climate activism. So we try to always get people involved, whether that's through volunteering, whether that's going and joining protests or going and joining other groups. We're big fans of lots of the youth-led organizations that are doing work in the climate space, Fridays for Future as an example, and really just trying to get them involved, because that's where the hope is going to come from, is seeing involvement, seeing community sort of tackling these programs. And without that, I think that, people just end up becoming jaded or cynical because there's nothing really out there saying like, yes, there's things you can do. So that's really where we come at it from. First, the education piece, and then sort of an interaction piece or community building.
Interesting. And just on this next question, so are there current and potential public policy interventions that can promote sustainable practices and trends? And I guess, again, this goes back maybe to youth, even getting more involved in things like political advocacy and changing regulations when it comes to the environment. So I'll give an example. One of the news stories I broke, this was a couple of years ago, was on that big single-use plastics ban that they had. And I remember that got upturned because I remember hearing about, I think it was last November. And again, there's like corporate interests involved, these big corporations and whatnot, and, the whole resistance to change. Do you want to talk more? I know maybe that's not really your kind of like your genre, maybe public policy and regulations, but do you have, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So it really isn't our forte. We usually, when people are really interested in that, we usually direct them to go to organizations that are working directly into that, because they're going to get way better support. They're going to know those issues way more in depth than we will. But I mean, there's still issues that we're working on. And, a lot of them still come down to the kind of core areas around water, waste, energy, transportation. Those are kind of like core areas no matter what you're doing, right? So we're often advocating for people to be aware of those issues, to learn about them, and to find places where they can sort of share their own skills and passions to help with that, right? And sometimes that's working with us. Sometimes that's working with other organizations that are doing that stuff. Sometimes it's going to protests. Sometimes it's self-organizing, and just really trying to encourage that and give people supports. Often we get people sending us emails or giving us calls and asking hey, such and such is a problem that I keep on seeing on my community. What should I do about it? And we say, well, here's some people to talk to. We don't know everything about every environmental issue that's going on, but these are some key places where you can do some research and, encourage people to advocate for themselves and be behind them to support them. But yeah, we end up working a lot with the organizations that do more of the lobbying work, just because a lot of our volunteers will say like, yeah, I really want to help you guys with this. Is there anywhere I can also do this? And then we say, yeah, here are places that you can go, and these are some campaigns going on and stuff like that.
Okay, great. And just a little, to ask more about your relationship with your volunteers. So how, like, I guess as an environmental nonprofit, how is working, what are your volunteers like? Like, why would people choose Green Calgary and choose to get involved and participate? Does your commitment to sustainability impact how your volunteers or even stakeholders experience what the organization is all about?
Yeah, 1 second. I do have another meeting coming in.
Sorry, yeah, I know we went a little bit over time. I'm just checking now. Just a couple more questions and then we're finished. And we'll wrap up.
I'm just going to let them know just to wait a second for me.
Okay.
I'll be right back. All right. Sorry. So you were asking about our volunteers?
Yeah.
Yeah. So our volunteer program, we have a lot of programming that we do throughout the year that's primarily volunteer led. So we often need a lot of help for those programs, but we try to sort of build community out of our volunteer pool. We get a lot of people coming in to volunteer with us who are new to Calgary. We show up pretty easily in searches and stuff like that. So people often find us out of the environmental organizations early on. And then we're able to help foster people's interests and find where they're going to be able to best put their efforts and stuff like that. And we like to hear from the volunteers because they'll often have new perspectives on, what's the important stuff to be dealing with and what issues they're facing. And then we can apply those to the different types of programming that we're doing. And when we have opportunities to letting volunteers use their expertise and sort of share their knowledge, that's really important to us as well.
So what attributes and characteristics do you believe contribute most to success when it comes to climate action? Do you have any sage advice for those pioneering sustainable change in Calgary through leadership and community building? So even any brands or businesses out there that want to become more inclusive in conducting more ethical business?
Yeah. So the sad reality is it's just a lot of work. There's no easy solution to a lot of these problems, but you can break that down into easier goals, right? But the thing that's the most important quality to have is just to stick with it. It's a lot of work, and there's it's not easy to make big changes, and especially not easy to make changes quickly. So just making sure that we're telling people keep at it, don't give up, don't get discouraged, set yourself attainable goals. And then as you reach them, set yourself more attainable goals. And that's kind of the key. And, it comes back to what I was saying right at the get-go, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. People need to take breaks. They need to recognize their own limits, but they also have to keep at it.
Right. No, that's great. And short, just to wrap up our interview. So what's the future vision for Green Calgary? Do you have any final thoughts or something you want to share that maybe I missed and whatnot?
Well, what we'd really like to see in the next couple of years here is even more collaboration within the environmental sector. We are seeing a lot now, and I feel like it's growing. There's a lot of really good energy, but just keeping that momentum going, working together more between different organizations and companies and levels of government, all that sort of stuff. Just more collaboration is really what we're looking for. And, we're really trying to get out there and show other people that we're working with how important environment is to other aspects. So talking about that intersectionality piece, just coming at it from the perspective of how important environment is to people's lives on the day-to-day in ways that they might not understand, and just showing like, hey, yeah, we need to all be supporting each other.
Okay, great. Okay, and that's all the questions I had. And thank you so much, Lex, for doing this interview for Sustainable You.
Thanks so much for tuning in to yet another eye-opening episode of Sustainable You. Again, this is an extraordinary and engaging info series whose purpose is to make sustainable development and sustainability accessible to the average person in their quest to quench their knowledge on environmentalism. Be sure to leave your feedback by liking this week's released edition and by subscribing to this podcast. Again, any love from our followers is much appreciated. Signing off until next time.